I'm going to be talking about React hooks. I'm going to skim over a lot of the basics because I've only got half an hour, so I want to try and keep it nice and concise. What I really want to talk about is what I think is one of actually the biggest selling point for hooks that is usually overlooked. So let me start actually by asking, raise your hand if you use React or if you've used React. Perfect. And raise your hand if you've used hooks. Perfect. Now, probably, when you use hooks, the main selling point for hooks, you've been told, is you don't have to use classes anymore. You could just use functions, and you never need to use classes again. And as a side sort of speech there, some people say, oh, actually, and you can also share behavioral, so stateful behavior. You can share that across components. And that, I think, is the biggest selling point that I will be talking about today, and it doesn't get emphasized enough. So I just wanted to focus on that a little bit. But I will briefly go over what hooks are anyway, very quickly, and why they're here. So let me click there. Let me get that out of the way. There we are. So hooks were introduced in React 16.8. I believe, how long ago was it now? About 3 months ago? Fairly recently. They allow, this is taken from the React documentation, right? They allow functional components to use state and other React features that were only possible with classes until now, right? So that's usually what people hear when they hear hooks. It's like, well, I don't need to use classes anymore. And that's true. But the motivation was manifold, right? So one of the main motivations was that it was hard before to reuse stateful logic between components. So if you wanted to share different behavior, so the same behavior across many components, before it was quite hard to do. You had to resort to more advanced techniques like higher order components and render props and stuff like that. And hooks just make that way, way simpler, as I'll show you later on. And then, again, this is from the React team itself. So components, or class components, they were quite hard to understand. You had to split it into smaller functions. You have component did mount, component will update, component will unmount, and you had to sort of split that behavior across. And also just classes confuse people and machines, apparently. So when using classes, you have to use the this keyword. You have to learn about binding. You have to learn about a lot of stuff. So technically, hopefully, hooks take a lot of that overhead away, and they make stuff a little bit simpler. Again, very briefly, I'm going to touch upon the basic built-in hooks that React uses. So useState is a hook that allows us to, just like before when we had classes, have state, only now we can have state in a function instead of a class. The way to use it is fairly simple. We just call useState, give it any initial state here, and then what we get back is an array, and the first value of the array is a getter for our value. So this is how we get the value, and then we get a setter, which is basically just a function that anytime we call that function, will change the value that's in here. The next one is useEffect, and useEffect is a little bit more complex, but useEffect essentially encompasses all of the life cycle that we had before with classes, right? So you can achieve very similar results as you would have done with component will mount, component did update, component will unmount, and all that stuff combined into one single function called useEffect. And the way it works is it takes two arguments. The first one is, what's the effect that I'm trying to run? And the second argument is an array. And the array is just dependencies of this effect, meaning when anything inside this array changes value, I'm going to compare them. And if it's different, OK, I'm going to run the effect again. Right? So it's not exactly the same mindset as you had when you were dealing with component will mount and all that stuff. It sort of combines everything into one, and it makes you think about state and synchronicity in quite a different way. Don't know what's happening. There you are. It's all very magical, and in order for us to not shoot ourselves in the foot, what React tells us is there's only a couple of rules that you need to follow to make sure that hooks work. The first rule is don't call hooks so only call hooks at the top level, right? So that means don't call it inside of loops or conditions or nested functions. I'm not going to go into the details as to why is, but if you do that, it's basically going to confuse React and try to get state that's not actually there. So it's going to be out of sync in a way. So that's happening under the hood for you. And then only call hooks from React functions. So if anyone, I've seen people, I teach at Flatiron, and I see students sometimes trying to call use state inside a class component, and right away you'll get an error saying, hey, no, you can only use it in a function. So you need to actually refactor the entire component. Cool. Now I'm going to talk about what I think is the best selling point for hooks. So building your own. Now, I mentioned you have use state and use effect, and there's a couple more that are built in, but usually you can combine all these, and you can create your own set of hooks. You can then sprinkle around any kind of React functional component that you have. This one, for example, is one that I built. Is use mouse coordinates. So all it's doing is it's originally setting state for an x and y of 0. And then what I get back is basically those values and a function that I can use to change these values, to update the values. And then I'm using an effect. And what I'm saying is, OK, let's create a listener that will get an event and get the x and y values from the event. And it's going to set those values here, basically. Now what we're saying is, OK, let's attach that to the window. So whenever the mouse moves on the window, trigger that listener. And then the return here, this is what many people think of as the component will unmount. What I'm saying is when the component leaves the page or when the effect refreshes, so I'm changing something, run this function here, which is basically just going to get the window and remove the event listener that I had attached before. This is to prevent any memory leaks, right? Because sometimes you have a component, the component subscribes to something, maybe a WebSocket, maybe an interval, and you want to make sure that if when the component is mounted is subscribing to this thing, well, when the component leaves the page, we should unsubscribe to this thing. We should remove the listener if we added a listener, and so on and so forth, right? So the breakdown, tear down of our component. And then it just returns the x and the y. So this combined, I'm using use state and use effect to track the mouse coordinates and to be able to not only track it for one component, but I could import this in any component. I could have 100 components, and each could be keeping track of its own, basically, mouse coordinates or anything else. OK, so let me show you what I mean. We have a component here, and this is an old school component, class component. We have some state, and we have a function to update the coordinates. And then when I'm mounting the component, I'm saying, I want you to start listening for mouse moves, and call that function. And then when the component leaves the page, when it's unmounting, I say, OK, I want you to now get rid of that listener. Right? It is working. You can see if I move the mouse around, that's great. And everything works. But if I go to app, and let's say that I wanted to have a second component that's doing something completely different, but it should also, for some reason, keep track of the mouse and where the mouse is. And I should be able to use that here. Great. So you can see that we have two components now. The second component currently is just a very static component, doesn't have any state or any of that information. And obviously, it's not following yet. And to make that follow, to be able for this component to now have access to the same kind of stateful behavior, to be able to track the mouse and to refresh that, I have a couple of options. In this case, I could just move everything out to app and then pass it down. But that's not always the case, right? In this case, we kind of share in the same mouse movement. But what if we wanted each component to have their own state and be able to track that separately? Well, my options right now, it would be basically copy all of this and paste it in the other component, right? And that will lead to a lot of code duplication that I'm pretty sure as developers, you've always heard the term dry. We should try to not repeat ourselves. And if we're doing this, now we have the same code repeated in many different places. That's kind of not what we want, because if we change something somewhere, we need to go and change the same thing everywhere else. The other options, it would be I could use something like a higher order component to provide this information. But then we're getting into more advanced sort of React topics. And that actually gives us an overhead of whenever we have higher order components are wrapping components that have another component inside. So we end up having the structure of our code, a lot of unnecessary elements rendering on the page, unnecessary components wrapping things. If you've ever used React DevTools in an enterprise app that uses a lot of higher order components, you may have seen that to get to the component that you want to get, first you need to start expanding, or use the search and you get there eventually. But you end up with this massive tree that is never ending until you get to the point you want, with a lot of seemingly useless components in between. So hooks will allow us to get rid of that. So what I'd like to do now is just a little bit of live coding with you. And I would like to be able to, first of all, change this component into a function component that will do exactly the same stuff that it's doing right now. So what I will do is create it like this. I don't need props, so I'm going to ignore that for now. Now, because it's a function, all that I care about is that it returns some JSX. Let's say we have a 0 here for now, and a 0. Great. So this is already working, but it doesn't have any of the behavior that we had before. So the next step is, OK, I want to be able to use state. To use state, I'm going to have to import use state. And I'm going to have to declare my state here. So the state that I'm creating is coordinates. So I'm going to call it coords. And the function to change the coordinates, the convention is if you call this coords, you call this set coords. If you call this x, you call this set x. And now the starting value for my state is going to be the same as before, an x and a y. And they start at 0. Cool. So right off the bat, I could come here, and I could pass this there. So we don't just have a static x and y, now we have a stateful x and y. So if these change, these are going to reflect that. Now, the next bit that I would like to do is, I want to be able to, when the component mounts, attach that listener to the window, and then when the component unmounts, remove that listener from the window. So what I'll do is, again, bit of boilerplate. So we have the function that I want to run, and then the list of dependencies. So when do I want this to change? When do I want the effect to trigger again? And in here, between the curly braces, I can write the code I want to actually take place at mount and unmount. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a listener. And what the listener is going to be doing is it's going to take an event. And when it gets the event, it's going to set coords. So it's going to call set coords. And in here, I'm going to pass a new x and a new y. X is going to be event x, and y is going to be event y. Slightly different from the code I wrote before, but it should achieve the same thing. Now, whatever gets returned from this use effect is what's going to happen when we want to tear down the component, when we're unmounting or when the effect refreshes. So what I would like to do here is, at some point, window, remove this listener, which is going to be a mouse move listener. And here's the listener. And now the main bit, which is, OK, at this point, when you run this effect, add an event listener. That's a mouse move. And it's got that there. Now, use effect is not defined, so don't forget to actually import it from there. Cool. And you can see that it's now doing the same that it was doing before, right? So behaviorally, it should be identical. And it's a couple of things to note is it's way smaller in terms of lines of code. I don't have to be using this dot everywhere. This dot state, this dot update chord. So I can get rid of that this keyword, which can be quite annoying. So the component is way less verbose. It's more concise. But more importantly, all of the things that I'm using to make this feature work are in one place, right? So this and this together, the listening, so the adding the event listener and the removing the event listener, they're all in the same place. And if you compare that with the class version, in here, well, we have everything spread all over. We have state up here. We have the function loosely here. Then we have a component did mount. So some stuff is happening in component did mount, and some stuff is happening in component will unmount. So it's sort of spread all over the place. Whereas here, it's all nicely in one effect and one state. Now, the real cool thing about this is that I can cut this out and put it somewhere else. And I'm going to create a function here called use mouse coordinates. And I'm just going to put that code in here. Same code as before. It's now outside of the component. And what I can do is just add a return here. So because this function is now outside, it needs to return something so I can use it. So it's doing all the stuff that it was doing before. The only difference is now I want to return the coordinates when I call this function. So I have access to that. So I can now say const coords. I get my coords from use coordinates. Cool. So it seems like a trivial thing, but what I managed to do is extract that stateful behavior, the stateful logic, away from the component itself. Right? So if you look at just the component now and you ignore this, look how concise that is, right? And more importantly, if I want this other component, the second component, to benefit from the same behavior, it's going to be way, way, way easier than before. So I can just get rid of this. Maybe I'm going to create a new folder. Let's call it hooks. And I'm going to say use mouse coords.js. I'm going to put it here. I need to import some stuff to make sure it works. So I was using use state and use effect. These come from React. And I also need to make sure that I export the function that I just created. So now, just like before, I can leave this exactly the same. All I have to do is import from hooks. Use mouse coords. Did I type something wrong? No, it's just in a different folder. There you go. Relative path had to go up. Cool. So still doing the same stuff it was doing before, exactly the same. The difference is now if I wanted to come to this second component, well, I'm actually going to have to change this into a function. Should be fairly easy. And I can copy this from there and copy this from there. Oops, that's fun. Cool. So, like I said, this is not the best example to be showing you because really I'm using the same mouse coordinates, so I could just move that up and reuse that. But if I was using clicks, for example, if I was using anything else, each component now is keeping track of its own state. And that's the beauty of this. I can reuse it, but I can make sure that each component has its own state and its own effect, and it's keeping track of all the things, and it's updating when it has to update. So who thinks that's cleaner than using the class that I was using before? Awesome. I genuinely think this is the main selling point for using hooks. It's not that you don't get to use classes anymore. That's nice, it's a bonus. But it's mostly, it just makes it so easy to compose hooks upon hooks and share. In fact, let's see if we can move. I think we're here. There we are. Can you see that? Perfect. One of the best things is this website called Use Hooks, if you haven't seen it before. This is a place where people post recipes that they call, for hooks that people created and they work really well. So you have use auth, if you want to be able to use authentication and have some provider for that. You have use event listener, if you want to be able to just use different kind of event listeners. Use why did you update, if you want to see why a component is updating when you're trying to profile something, for example. Use dark mode. You can see if the user has dark mode set in the preferences or not. And this is all code that someone else wrote, right? And at some point, what we're doing is we're building this library of hooks that we can reuse over and over so we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. We're going to have basically a shop where we can go and say, just install this library, right? In fact, I wrote a couple of libraries as NPM packages, and you can just do NPM install this hook and use it. And you can use it among any components that you want, right? So I think they're pretty cool. I think we have a little bit of extra time. So I'm just going to so what are the next steps? If you hadn't used hook.smarts before and you want to get into hooks, my first recommendation would be take a look at the documentation. The React documentation is really good, and the team is making sure that whenever something happens, so they're always keeping that up to date. I think they change almost on a daily basis, and they're very, very fresh. So that's the first place that you should look at. If you want to get more into detail as to how hooks work and how React works under the hood, Dan Abramov writes a blog at overreacted.io, and he writes some really interesting articles about how does use effect work under the hood, and why is it important that you only call use state and use effect outside of loops and conditionals, right? So why is that rule there? Why can you not just put it inside an if and it will just work anyway? Beware, some of the posts that he writes are about 45-minute reads, so they're getting closer to books instead of posts, but they're there. Secondly, just check that website that I showed you. It has lots of really cool examples, and it's really empowering when you just grab an example, move it here, you can put it in your list of hooks, and you can reuse it across your entire application. And now you can share behavior across components, which is pretty awesome. Cool. I'm done.